Wang, autumn night. The moon begins to wax. The autumn dew is light. Her dress is too sheer, but she does not change it. All night she plays her silver lute, absorbed, possessed, depressed by her empty room, unwilling to return. So we continue with the 7-word quatrain Joyful. This is the second and last poem of Wang included in this section. It's a pretty different poem from the one we talked about yesterday. So this poem is pretty straightly another take on a genre that we've encountered time and time again in this collection. In this case, it's the wakefulness at night trope. So the woman is alone in her chambers, missing her beloved, her paramour, and is unable to fall asleep because of that. And she becomes an object of beauty, melancholy, and sadness, exposed through the poem to the reader's gaze. So, what else can we say about this poem? Well, first of all, as opposed to the one we read yesterday, this is not one of Wang Wei's most famous poems. In fact, it is even disputed that it was actually written by Wang Wei. It's included in his collected works in Juan 15, or the supplemental collection, but there it is. Its attribution is doubted. It might have been the work of a certain Wang Ya, of whom I haven't heard news of anywhere else. In that section, it is paired with another poem. In fact, it's the second of two autumn night songs. There's a first one which I'll read later after we finish with this, and there's the second one. And those two poems are in Paul Rose's edition of the Poetry in Prose of Wang Wei. And after we've finished dealing with this translation, we'll take a look at the other version in Rose's volume and the other poem that antecedes this one. So we've already talked about the topic. The topic is wakefulness at night. You could say that, as is pretty usual in quatrains, you could say the first couplet paints the scene, sets the time and the place, and even obliquely the protagonist, and then the second couplet moves on into a more subjective realm by giving us a description of what the character is doing in the scene and how she is feeling as well. And it's stated pretty explicitly, whereas some of these quatrains sometimes just prefer to imply the feelings through the depiction of the surroundings. In this one, we do get a very explicit statement of the state of mind of the female poetic persona who is presumably living the story narrated in this poem. So as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So the first couplet, the moon begins to wax. The autumn dew is light. Her dress is too sheer, but she does not change it. So as I said, the first couplet sets the scene. So the moon begins to wax, so it's at nighttime, and the autumn dew is light. The season of the year is autumn, probably early autumn, because the autumn dew is light, and it was believed that as the season got colder and as we got closer to winter, the dew became heavier and colder as well, giving way to frost. So the moon begins to wax. That disconcerts me a bit. Does it indicate is presumed to indicate the time of the month? Because as you know, the moon waxes and wanes in a cycle. It waxes after the full moon has, well, wax and wane. No, it's still growing, so this would mean that probably this is the beginning of the month. But then again, in the other translation that I have consulted, a completely different word is used. But anyway, if we follow this translation, it seems like it's the moon begins to wax, is pointing us at the fact that it's probably early in the month. And as we said, the second part of the line tells us it's autumn and probably early autumn, which is, we've talked in hundreds, I would say, of poems in this collection of the reverberances of autumn, which are always meant to be a sad, melancholy season of decline and decay. So the first line describes the season, the time of year, the time of day. The second one starts to zoom in on the character. Uh, we get a very succinct description that only centers on the fact that her dress is too sheer, but she does not change it. Sheer, I had to consult this word in the dictionary. It means very thin, very light. So this probably further confirms the idea that the poem is set in late summer, early autumn, because probably very early autumn, because she still hasn't changed her clothes from the summer. And probably the coldness, which is a physical one, but also a spiritual one that she is feeling because she is lonely. Both of them should have moved her to change her clothing. But such is her state of bewilderment, of depression, that she is completely indifferent to any preoccupation about clothing and appearance. And this is already hinting at the psychological state of depression and obsession in which this abandoned lady lives. But that's part of the second couplet. The second couplet, as I said, moves us into not her looks or the background, but on what she is doing and how she is feeling. In fact, the third line, you could say, centers on what she's doing, but includes some adjectives of feeling. And then the last line centers on feelings. So, second couplet, all night she plays a silver lute, absorbed, possessed, depressed by her empty room, unwilling to return. So all the night, she spends all the night awake, not going to sleep, and she's playing her silver lute. Again, this is yet another instrument. It's not the chin and it's not the zi, it's another stringed instrument that was popular in China. I had never heard about it before until this poem. It's described as silver. I imagine that means it probably has some coating. I don't think it would be a solid silver instrument, but this silver color definitely associates us with the moon and with the night and with this pale gleaming. So this woman has been playing this silver instrument, silvery, ghostly, nocturnal, as the woman herself in the sadness she is feeling. And then we start getting her feelings: absorbed, possessed, depressed. So these three adjectives really sum it up. She's absorbed in her loneliness and in her love for the absent person, possessed as if by a demon, by this melancholy, by this forlornness, by this love, and depressed by, or you could say this: absorbed, possessed, depressed, focuses on the empty room. There's the room, because it's empty and because it's acting as a signifier of the absence of the beloved, generates these feelings of absorbedness, possessedness, depression, and the space is negativized as an evoker of loneliness and sadness, and therefore the woman is unwilling to return. She's spending the whole night outside in the cold, scantily clad and exposed to the growing cold of the season, but also to the growing coldness of the passage of time and her aging while she's away from the beloved person. So, okay, it's a well-constructed poem. I like how each line, builds up to a crescendo. It's very conventional, though. You could say also that Way City Song is very conventional as well, because the topic of separation is one of the perennial ones in this anthology and in classical Chinese poetry. But this poem is also very conventional. We've read lots of poems of women awake at night, playing musical instruments, and outside in the cold. Anyway, let's take a look at the other version. So this is the translation of Geoffrey Waters in my edition of 300 Tang Poems. In the Poetry and Prose of Wang, Volume 2, by Paul Rosa, we have this other version of the same poem. And it says, "The moon has just risen. Autumn dew is slight. Though light gauze already feels too thin, she has yet to change her clothes. She earnestly strums her silver thither through the long night. She dreads her empty room and cannot bear to go back to it. So as you can see, pretty similar. Perhaps the biggest divergence is in the beginning. The moon has just risen. So I would have to check if wax is being used in Waters' poem with that meaning, with the meaning that the moon has just waxed, has just ascended into the sky, or if it's the more conventional meaning of waxed. But definitely, Rosa interprets the image, it seems to interpret the image differently. It's like the moon has just risen. So it's probably not that late in the night, at least in the first line. Yeah? Perhaps the idea in Rosa's version is that the poem is still set, at least in the beginning, in the first couplet, early night, and then the second couplet puts the emphasis on how, from that starting point, all the night goes on with the woman awake and without returning to her chambers. Otherwise, the poem is pretty much the same in both versions. But as I said, in Rosa, this poem is actually number 2 of a set of 2 called Autumn Night, 2 songs. And the first one, just out of curiosity, reads like this, and also has the typical images of autumn. Clepsydra drops ring out, how long the night seems. Endless the light shadows cast by the dewy moonlight. Autumn presses on the hidden insects who resound through the night. Winter clothes not yet sent. Frost now falls in the desert.